Okay, let me explain the ontological argument for God's existence. It goes back to Saint Anselm during the Middle Ages, but it also has been reformulated by Rene Descartes had a version of it, and also more recently Alvin Plantinga. So it's something that's been debated. And here's how the argument goes: What's the greatest being you can conceive of in the universe? Well, that's God. Now here's the question: the greatest, the most perfect being, that'd be God. Now here's a question: Suppose this being just exists as an idea in your head, or suppose this being exists in reality. Which one is the greater? Something that just exists in your head, or one that exists in reality? Well, of course, it's the one that exists in reality. Which would you rather have? A pile of money in the bank, an imaginary pile of money, or a real pile of money in the bank? You'd go for the real pile of money in the bank. It's the same thing with God. Is that if you're thinking about God, by force of definition, God has to exist in reality. Because if you say, well, I think of God, but it just exists as a mental concept, well, that's not the greatest being you're thinking of. The greatest being, by definition, has to exist in reality. And that's how it goes. And we've been arguing it over that argument for a real long time. The problem is that we haven't come to a solid conclusion. Like I said, Thomas Aquinas, Nisa, that's your guy, Catholic. Thomas Aquinas disagreed with him, and he had three arguments against it. But as I pointed out, is that Aquinas fudges, is that you know he says, like, it's not precise enough, but then Thomas Aquinas gives these imprecise arguments in his five ways. Uh, let's see, Immanuel Kant said that existence is not a predicate. That another argument is that, well, you just can't imagine something into existence. But the question is, okay, when you're dealing with God, God's not just not a normal object like a piece of paper or an apple. God's a different type of object, so of course God exists in reality. So that's how the argument goes. It's just never been settled. People just ignore it. They think it's fishy, that it's kind of like some word trickery, but we just can't refute it. And that's kind of an interesting argument. That's why I think it's interesting in the context of evolution, because evolution and Big Bang Theory can account for the cosmological and teleological arguments, although Richard Dawkins would disagree about the teleology that evolution provides. He doesn't think evolution provides a type of teleology. But the ontological arguments, the question arises, okay, why would we evolve believing the ontological argument, or find the ontological argument compelling? So that's the story behind the ontological argument. Which is greater, God that exists in imagination or God that exists in reality? The God exists in reality. And so if you think, well, God just exists in my mind, well, that's not the greatest being. He has to exist in reality for him to be the greatest being that you think of. So there you go. And I think I need to get to bed now.